Hello, this is Adam, and welcome to Rare Classic Cars. Today I thought I'd talk about something that a number of you have asked about a number of times, and that is what are some good classic cars to buy at reasonable prices and how to find them. Now, if you've been watching the channel for some time, I did a video on how I typically find cars, but it's worth mentioning again. And really, to be honest, you can certainly go and find cars at auctions or on dealer websites. And I try to avoid those as best as I can. I have bought some cars from dealers. I think in total out of my collection that's pretty large, I've bought 2 from dealers, if I recall correctly. And that was after negotiating with both of them for a period of many months. For one vehicle, I negotiated with a dealer for maybe a year, just because of his expectations of what the price of the car should be versus mine. So it took some considerable effort. But by and large, where I find my vehicles is one place now, and that's Facebook Marketplace, which is good and bad. I find the Facebook user interface isn't that great, but that's where a lot of cars are with, let's say, low miles and good deals. Now, you can't just say, I'll make this up, I want a 1972 Pontiac Granville, and expect to go out to Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or an auction site or anything like that and think that there's going to be many of them available. That's not true anymore. These cars are pretty extinct. The survival rate is very low. And for a car that you might be looking for, especially if it's a specific year, make, and model, there may be a couple hundred left in the US, maybe several hundred. And that's not really that many in terms of what may come up for sale. And that's vehicles in any kind of condition. So you're going to have to look and you're going to have to search for some time, particularly if you want a specific year, make, and model. And if you really narrow it down to year, make, model, and color, or year, make, model, and let's say specific options, you're going to be waiting a while until you find one. They're just not out there. There's not that many left. But if you keep looking over a period of months and in some cases years, one will pop up. And I can say for a number of vehicles, I still am looking for a 1972 Oldsmobile 88 Coupe. And I'd settle for a 71 Oldsmobile 88 Coupe. I don't want a 73 or 4. I've got a 75. And I've seen a few for sale on Facebook Marketplace and other places. But for me, it has to have the 455. That's a deal breaker if it doesn't. And I've seen probably 3 for sale over the last 4 or 5 years, 3 or 4 for sale. So that kind of gives you a sense of how many pop up. And those were ones that were in good condition. And probably should have bought one, but it slipped through my fingers. I was going to go take a look at it, and before I could get to it, somebody else had bought it. And that was a really nice one, a 71. It was red with black top and black interior in the Cleveland, Ohio area on Facebook Marketplace. So you're going to have to look and you're going to have to continue looking for the car you want. Now, what are some vehicles, if you're looking to get into the collector car hobby, that, reasonably priced and are really good cars? Well, here's a few ideas. The first is the 1971 to 78 Ford LTD and Mercury Marquis. And that includes the LTD Bromes, or the LTD Landaus later, and the Marquis Bromes as well, or the Grand Marquis later. These cars, for whatever reason, don't have a lot of value to collectors, but they're wonderful driving cars. They're still relatively economical to buy, and they give you just a great experience. They're well built, they're fun to drive. I would recommend, if you get an LTD, you want either the 400 engine or the 460 or 429 engine from 1973 and before. Those are going to just be really nice driving cars. The 351, and that is a bit of a slug, especially if you get a 351 from the mid-70s and later. They're just really choked down with smog and emissions and things like that. But the 400s, the 429, 460 are all really pleasant in those cars. And they really don't have much that goes wrong with them. You get a C6 transmission, or at worst an FMX transmission behind some of the engines, and that's a good transmission as well. Really heavy duty, often 9-inch rear end from Ford. The engines are quite durable. Some of the later 400s and 351Ms do have some oil pressure issues and bottom end issues. But if you're finding something with low miles, I think in general you're going to be fine. Some even had casting porosity issues in the late 70s. So I would really recommend, if you can get one from 71 to 73, even 71 or 72, the Beak on the LTD, or the Mercury that has, I would say, the pre-big bumpers. Those are really, really, really nice cars. The 73 and 4s are still really nice. The 75s to 8s started taking some cost out. They're not quite as nice, but they're still good vehicles. You can pick them up very economically, especially the four-door cars, the four-door pillared sedans. The four-door hardtops are wonderful. I bought my 73 LTD Brougham Coupe that cosmetically was perfect, just needed some light mechanical work, from a dealer, from a Ford dealer off of the trade-in lot back in 2020 for $6,800. Like I said, cosmetically perfect, had some issues with the carburetor that caused it not to run very well, but the car was rock solid, perfect interior, exterior, chrome. Didn't get much better. It was a 460 car as well, which was rare. You could get the 351, 400, 429, and 460 in that car in 1973. So again, that's kind of at the top of my list. If you're just looking for a really affordable, great to drive classic, they have a wonderful ride. Doors close extremely solidly, especially if you get a 400 with a 2-barrel carburetor, very reliable. The 4-barrel carburetors from Ford, as we talked about in this show, aren't necessarily, but you can change them out to Edelbrocks or Holleys very easily. So that's kind of at the top of my list. I would say second on the list, if you want a reliable vehicle, is a 1971 to 76 Delta 88 or Olds 98 or Buick LeSabre and Electra. Especially, you really want one with the big block engine, the 455s. Now, why not the Chevrolets, Pontiacs, and Cadillacs? Well, those command more money for whatever reason. It's not that they're worse vehicles. It's just that you can pick up the Oldsmobile and Buick versions, I find, for a fraction of the price of the Chevrolets. It's one reason why I don't have many Chevrolets in my collection. They're often the most expensive to buy. And General Motors vehicles, in terms of the full-size cars, are often the most expensive of the GM, Ford, and Chrysler trio. But for whatever reason, this kind of 71 to 76 Olds 88, 98 Buick LeSabre Electra, the prices still seem to be very reasonable, particularly for four-door cars. And they're great vehicles. They do have some of that GM jiggle that I talk about. The doors don't close all that nicely. The interiors are a little cheap, but they do have that big car ride. And they actually ride really well, and they're very, very quiet at speed. And the engines and transmissions are wonderful. So as compared to the Fords that I mentioned before, they have really stiff body structures, good door closures, and frankly, even good interiors, especially in the early years, the 71s, 2s, and 3s. The GM cars don't have the same quality of the interior in particular, or the door closures. But I still think they're fun, and they're reasonably priced, especially the Olds and Buick version. So take a look at one of those. Third on my list, again, sticking with Olds and Buick because for whatever reason, the price point in the market is pretty reasonable, are the 77 to 85, could be 84 depending on the model, Olds 88, 98 Buick LeSabre Electra again. So the subsequent generation that was downsized. If you want a Caprice now of that era, or an Impala, or the Cadillacs, or in some cases even the Pontiacs, they tend to be a bit pricey. And even some of the Olds and Buicks are getting pricey from that generation. I think people really love them. They have a nostalgia for them. Interestingly, the later versions of that car, the kind of the 83, 4, 5, are the most expensive to procure. And the 77, 8, 9 are the least expensive. But the 77, 8, 9 have the bigger engines in them. I would get those all day long. You just don't want one that has a turbohydromatic 200 transmission in it. Stay away from that. But if it's got anything other than that transmission, and you could get an Olds 403, which wasn't known as a race engine, but pretty peppy. Just don't rev it a lot. Olds 350s, Buick 350s in those, as opposed to the later ones just having the Olds 307, which I think is kind of a slug in those cars. Those are really nice vehicles. Drive great, ride great, quiet. There was a mint condition Olds 98 that actually is now for sale on Bring a Trailer that I could have bought from a dealer in Ohio off of Facebook Marketplace for like $14,000. Now another dealer's bought it. It's trying to flip it on Facebook Marketplace. I probably should have bought it because it was a black Olds 98 with like 10,000 miles, red interior, had the optional rear wheels, no vinyl roof, really rare car. Didn't have the Olds 403 though. It had a 350. And I like those cars, but personally, from a style perspective, they're not my style. I like the 60s era cars, but everybody likes something different, and they're great cars. And I have some, and I've owned others. I think they're great. So that's another one on the list. Next, I would say is if you want a front wheel drive vehicle, kind of a classic, the 88 to 1990 or 91, again, depending on the model year, Buick LeSabre Electra Olds 88, 98. And why did I pick 1988 when this body style started in 1985 for the 98 and Electra? Because 88 is the first year of the 3800 engine. And also by that point, General Motors had gotten the kinks out of the 4T60 transmission. It had by then, a number of refinements to help improve its reliability, and it was just much better overall. The 3800, the pre-series 1 engine that's in those vehicles, is phenomenal. You can get 300,000 miles out of them, very reliable. And those cars, again, starting in that 88 model year, I wouldn't really touch ones from 85, 6. 87 is better, but the 88s are really good all the way through 91. So it's kind of a budget classic. They're not that expensive, but they're fun. And they get great mileage. You'll get 30 miles per gallon on the highway with them, maybe even more than that. So it's hard, not to like them. I've had, of those cars, the Olds and the Buicks, 5, 6 of them in my lifetime. They're great. Stay away from the Cadillacs with the 4.1 liter V8. Again, I say that having owned probably 4 or 5 of them and never having an issue, but people did have issues with them. The Cadillacs with the 4.5 that came out in 1988, the 4.9 that came out in 1991, those are much better engines. But you also pay more for the Cadillacs. The Olds and Buicks, again, kind of this brands that I think people forget about. So another good one. And lastly, I'll say Chryslers in particular, the Chrysler C-bodies, the full-size cars from 71 to 73, I think are a lot of fun for the price. What's interesting is if you want the Plymouth, like the Fury or the Dodge Monaco, you're going to pay more than a Chrysler Newport or New Yorker. And especially if you get a New Yorker, you get the 440 V8 standard, which is wonderful. So I really recommend, if you can find one, a 71 to 3 Chrysler New Yorker, because for whatever reason, they're not, collectors don't want them all that much compared to the Plymouths and Dodge. Then you get the 440. So, and they look great. Those fuselage era Chryslers look wonderful. 73 is pretty heavy-handed front end. The 71 and 2, I think, look wonderful. And the 73 is also a good car. After that, they revised it, and then you start getting into a few years later, the lean burn carburetor and stuff like that. Just forget about it. The 71, 2, and 3, I think, are really, really nice cars, good driving cars. One thing I'll say about them is a little tinny. They're a little noisy on the inside at speed compared to the Fords and GMs of the era. They are unibody cars, but they're fun. You don't see them, and you bring them to a car show, and people will drool over it just because they're so rare. So in any case, I hope that gives you an idea of some classic vehicles that are affordable that you might want to take a look at. Let me know if you like this video, and we can discuss more. Thanks again for watching.